This is just the beginning.
Welcome to today's event. I'm Dave Lawler, World News Editor for Axios, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you joining us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or on the Axios website. I'm joining you today from the Outer Banks in North Carolina for our event, What's Next? Navigating the Post-Pandemic World. I'd like to thank the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for partnering with Axios for today's event. Today's conversation takes place on the 19th anniversary of 9/11. And over the next 45 minutes, my colleague Bethany Ellen Ibrahimian and I will be leading a discussion on the future of American foreign policy, the power players in Asia, and what's next for the Middle East. We'd encourage you to join the conversation at Axios on Twitter and hashtag Axios Events. I'm joined now by Maha Yahya. She's the director of Carnegie's Middle East Center, and she's joining from Beirut, Lebanon. Welcome, Maha.
Hi, Dave. How are you?
Great. Maha, I want to discuss what's happening there in Beirut, but first I want to start with the regional view. You've described this as the decade of Arab decisions. So what are those decisions that states across the region are having to grapple with, and why now?
Well, thank you for having me on this show. I think there are a number of reasons why this is a decade of Arab decisions. Basically, Arab governments across the region, and I know it's a broad sweep, but Arab governments, for the most part, across the region have to decide whether they're going to maintain the kind of very exclusionary approach to governance, or they're going to open up and be more inclusive in their approach. Until now, the response has been, very widely, very, very loudly. We're going to maintain a very exclusionary approach to governance, which means more and more people feel left out. More and more people feel that they're operating on the margins. This is coming at a time when the region is facing a significant economic crisis and a significant health crisis. Even oil exporting countries in the region have a significant budget deficit. The whole rentier system that the whole region relied on, basically using money to establish a network, clientelist networks, both within countries but also between countries. For example, between countries of the Gulf and resource-poor countries like Lebanon or Jordan or others. This whole system is collapsing. It does not have any more currency. They simply don't have the finances for it. So we're seeing decisions being taken across the region, even in countries like Saudi Arabia, where there is a shrinking, if you want, the kinds and size of subsidies that were provided is decreasing. But at the same time, this is not being accompanied by more freedoms anywhere in the region. The opening up on the social front in a place like Saudi Arabia, and a country like Saudi Arabia, is simply not enough. So I think the question is, will they maintain this at a time when they can no longer sustain the authoritarian bargain of your freedom for some services? The state can no longer be the major provider of services. It cannot it can no longer be the major provider of housing, of all the kinds of different services we've seen before. On top of that, I think we're in a situation where it's not just about governance, but it's also about the economy. The gap between the haves and the have-nots in the region, across the region, but also between countries like the region, is huge. In this region has a country like Yemen, which is one of the poorest in the world, and which is undergoing a huge civil war and a significant humanitarian crisis. And countries like Gulf, which are incredibly resource rich. So, and then within countries, those that have captured state assets, those that have captured the economic opportunities provided by the state are very far and few in between compared to the rest of the population. This is also at a time when you have 4 countries in the region going through a significant conflict. It's causing massive population displacement across the region. which also means there's a fundamental transformation in the demographic makeup of these countries. But above and beyond that, also there's also a fundamental decline in a lot of the development, really basic development indicators that we have taken for granted. Things like the percentage of children who are out of school, the percentage of individuals who are now they're suffering from diseases like cholera that had once been eradicated in this region, and so on and so forth. So there's a real decline on development indicators across the board, particularly in conflict-ridden countries, but also in countries that are hosting refugees, like Lebanon and Jordan. Lebanon today has one of the highest per capita refugees across the region. Just one final thing, I think also the issue of education is fundamental. This is not just about transforming the educational curricula to kind of enable students, basically to move away from rote learning towards more critical thinking and to enable students to fend for themselves as adults. So I think the fundamental question also is, what does it mean to have an education in the 21st century? This is not a question only for this region, but it's a much broader question that this region is still very far from even asking, let alone responding to. And this is very evident now when the response to the pandemic, as a result of the coronavirus, COVID-19, like everywhere else in the world, there have been major shutdowns. People have been forced to stay at home. Kids have been forced to stay at home. And the gap between those who were able to sustain their educational levels through online learning and those that were not is massive. It's just massive.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, the point about education, and not one that I'd seen talked about as much as I have in your writing, that basically the kinds of critical thinking skills people will need to diversify the economy have not been prioritized previously, because these are regimes that don't necessarily want critical thinkers in the population to a certain degree. But I want to first, before we delve into all of those various issues, I do want to bring it to Lebanon, where you're sitting. Obviously, many of the regional difficulties that you've described apply particularly to Lebanon, which was in a financial crisis before the explosion last month. How do those kinds of decisions that you describe governments facing, how do they apply specifically in the Lebanon context?
Well, Lebanon takes all of these problems and amplifies them considerably in ways that we really haven't thought of before. This is a country that is facing a significant governance crisis. It has a particular power-sharing model that is one that basically shares where individuals or different communities, sectarian and ethnic communities, share power. The implementation of this power sharing has enabled a sectarian political elite to basically hold on to power under the name or the rubric of defending their own communities. It's also allowed them to plunder state institutions. It's allowed them to create a clientelistic, nepotistic network of business cronies. And not necessarily even business cronies, but basically clientelistic networks across state institutions. If we want to talk about state capture, this is probably the one place where you can see it up front and center in ways that are just mind-boggling. And so today, Lebanon is facing not only this kind of massive governance challenge, which has driven the country not to the brink of an abyss, but actually into the abyss. Lebanon today is facing a perfect storm of a massive economic and financial crisis. The public debt of the country is estimated at around 80 billion, and this was a few months ago. The central bank, which would have usually been the one to kind of the one entity to come in and help address the political situation, the economic situation, is unable to, because it itself is complicit in this crisis, and it has its own massive debt. There's a major currency devaluation. The currency's lost 70 to 80% of its value, which means that the middle class is disappearing. Just to give you one example, an assistant professor at the American University of Beirut used to make something like 66,000 US dollars, or the equivalent of that in Lebanese lira. Those $66,000 per year are now 11,000 per year. This is for a professor, an assistant professor at the preeminent university in Beirut. So people's pensions have disappeared, their incomes have disappeared, inflation is incredibly high. And yet, facing in front of these disasters, there's complete political paralysis. It's almost, any one of those issues would have caused a government and an entire system to come tumbling down. And yet the political elite persist. They hold on to power in ways that we didn't think imaginable. The epitome of this marriage between corruption, a business network, and a political elite was the explosion, the catastrophic explosion that took place on August 4th in Beirut, which affected almost half the city. 300,000 people were made homeless, more than 200 people killed, 6,500 people injured. There isn't a single person in the city that wasn't touched in one way or the other. And we're still living the aftershock. Today, there's another fire in the port, a massive one. And people are just reliving the trauma of August 4th. The panic in the city is just, I can't even begin to describe it. And again, it's this complete criminal negligence. The fact that you would allow close to 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate to languish in the heart of the city, in the port, for close to 6 years. The port, Beirut as a city was built, it grew around its historic port. That you would allow this amount of ammonium nitrate to languish in the heart of a city, surrounded by residential areas. This is Lebanon's own Chernobyl, if you want. This kind of mix of bad governance, corruption, and everything that comes in between.
And this might be the last question we have time for, but looking forward, first looking backwards, we're a decade on from the Arab Spring. You've written about the fact that we have increasing political repression at the top, but also increasing political engagement among society. So those are two factors that are going to increasingly come into conflict in the region. I'm interested in the tension between those two things. And also I want to bring in a question we got from the audience, an emailed question, which was how will the economic fallout of coronavirus affect all of that among the populations of the Middle East?
Well, I'll start with the last one and with the audience question and come back to this one. In terms of the coronavirus fallout, I think it's massive. The IMF was predicting something like, if I'm not mistaken, a 25% decline in economic output and in GDP. I don't know whether they've revised these figures, but it's quite huge for the region. I think the fallout also will differ from place to place, from country to country. So a country like Lebanon, which was already in crisis, is going to face the impact of the pandemic is far more significant. Places like Yemen and Syria, where the pandemic itself was instrumentalized. So I think it varies from place to place. Some countries have the fiscal capacity to invest. We're seeing in Dubai significant investments in kind of kickstarting the economy again. Places like Jordan, like Tunisia, don't have that facility. To move, since I mentioned Tunisia, to move to the other part, which is the increasing political engagement on the ground, that is for certain. And this is why I think for Arab governments, they do need to kind of recognize this. Across the region, people were talking about the Arab winter after the uprising in Syria became a civil war, and Bahrain was clamped down very hard, and it seemed like the so-called, and we know what happened. The coup happened in Egypt, and. So the sense was, this was at best a foreign conspiracy, at worst, nothing's going to come out of it. Fast forward, we have Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, Iraq. People are back on the streets saying we want better lives. Bottom line is, they need to be taken into account. This is a very engaged population, a youth that has nowhere else to go and does not want to go elsewhere. We hear it on the streets of Beirut. We don't want to immigrate. We want to stay in this country, and we want to build this country again. And this sentiment is echoed across the region, across cities and villages and towns across the region.
Well, thank you so much, Maha. That's unfortunately all we have time for. I'm sure we could have, kept that conversation going for quite a bit longer. But now I'm going to turn it over to our China reporter, Bethany Allen-Ibrahimian, for our next segment.
Our next guest is Vice President for Studies of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Evan Feigenbaum, joining us live from Chicago, Illinois. Welcome, Evan.
Hi, Bethany.
You recently wrote in an essay that Beijing and Washington are competing to set Asia's rules, norms, and standards, but other countries in the region are increasingly choosing to shape its future themselves. What changes have you seen in Asia over the past 25 years?
Well, the United States and China are the two strongest powers in Asia. And so not surprisingly, and actually intuitively, many people assume that the region's future is either one or the other countries to win. Or to put that another way, the region's either going to have a China-centric future or it's going to have an American-centric future. Or some people argue that you'll have kind of a halfway house that looks a little bit like the Cold War did, where the region will essentially divide into two contending blocks, with some countries lining up with China and some countries lining up with the United States. And I think that view of the region's future was probably best encapsulated in something that President Obama said in 2016 when he was trying to sell the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement domestically. You may remember this. He said, if the United States doesn't write the rules, China will write the rules out in that region. In other words, the future rules, standards, and norms of Asia will either be American-centric or it'll be China-centric. But if President Obama had been correct about that, then when President Trump withdrew the United States from TPP in 2017, what should have happened? Logically, China should have come in and become the rule writer and standard setter for the region. But as we know now, in fact, that's not what happened at all. What happened instead was that the 11 remaining parties in the TPP, partly through Japanese and also Australian leadership, came together, cohered the agreement, and set the region's trade and investment standards with neither the United States nor China in the room. And the fact that that happened, I think, stems a lot from the way that the region evolved, particularly after the Asian financial crisis in 1997 and 98. As a result of the last 25 years or so, you have a lot of countries in the region not called China or the United States that are sizable, they're capable, they're highly self-interested, and they have a will and a capacity to action. A lot changed between 1998, the end of the Asian crisis, and then the global crisis in 2008. It bookended this very tumultuous decade. In the first, you had a kind of incipient Pan-Asian regionalism. You may remember the United States bailed out Mexico in 1994 and then refused to bail out Thailand 3 years later in 1997 and paid an enormous price in Southeast Asia for that. So that was the moment when a lot of Asian countries began to look to one another for solutions, particularly to the economic problems that bedeviled the region, and not just to Washington and its preferred institutions. And so a lot of the Pan-Asian ideas, ideologies, pacts, agreements, trade deals, swap arrangements, they really trace their origin to that period. But while the region is not necessarily wedded to an American-centric future because of that incipient Pan-Asianism, everybody's afraid of China, particularly for security reasons. And so nobody really wants to live in a Sino-centric Asia either. And after 2008, Asian economies became much larger in relative terms. These governments became more capable. They became capital exporters, not just capital recipients. They're consumers, not just producers and exporters. And so what's happened is increasingly we have a more Asian Asia, but a more Asian Asia that's not necessarily a Sino-centric Asia. And I think the problem, particularly in the debate in Washington, is that these two are often conflated and confused.
How does it look to countries in Asia that are not China and not the US? This increasing rivalry and competition that we're seeing between the US and China, what does that look like to Indonesia, to Japan, to South Korea, to India?
Well, I think it makes them uncomfortable because, as I said, China's widely distrusted, and I think there's enormous ambivalence about the rise of Chinese power from Tokyo to New Delhi to Hanoi, really all over the region. But I think what's happened is that the region is really heading for a future that looks more like fragmentation than either unipolarity, as I said, one way or the other, or a rigid bipolarity. What do I mean by fragmentation? I mean just that Asian countries may engage in self-help, where function drives form rather than rigid form driving function. And you end up with a patchwork of rules and a discombobulated set of norms, and countries tacking back and forth betwixt and between China and the United States on different functional issues. And if you want to see that in practice, let's just take a look at maybe 2 or 3 issues. One would be trade and investment, a second would be data governance, and a third would be infrastructure. The region's trade and investment standards are likely to be set within 5 years by 2 trade agreements, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the former TPP, and something called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And in both of those, neither the United States nor India is a party to the agreement, despite all the talk about an Indo-Pacific region. So the economic architecture of the region, where standards and norms and rules are set, may include neither Washington nor New Delhi. And then one of them, the TPP, doesn't include China. So you essentially have these other countries stepping up, becoming rule writers, standard setters, and norm givers themselves. I think the same thing is also happening in an area like data governance. My colleagues at Carnegie India in New Delhi, which is our center there, do an enormous amount of really interesting work on how data rules, norms, and standards are shaping up both domestically in India and India's view of cross-border data rules and flows. And that includes things like data access and transfers. And even though India and Japan share a deep ambivalence about Chinese power, even in many ways, the United States, Japan, and India are coming together in ad hoc coalitions as these security dynamics begin to become more confrontational in Asia. India really has set a bunch of domestic standards on data that have a lot of localization provisions that are not to American liking. And when Prime Minister Abe of Japan pushed a major cross-border data initiative called the Osaka Initiative, India and Indonesia, another country that you mentioned, were among those that didn't sign up to the initiative. So on data, too, you have fragmentation, countries setting their own rules, norms, and standards, and a patchwork where function drives form. The same is true on infrastructure. There's a lot of talk about China's so-called Belt and Road Initiative. But long before China had a Belt and Road, which started in 2013, places like Japan were doing enormous amounts of infrastructure finance around the region. The biggest infrastructure investor in India for a long time was Japan. It was never China. The Delhi Metro, the Mumbai-Delhi Industrial Corridor, high-speed rail for Indian Railways. A lot of this was done with Japanese financing through the Japan Bank for International Cooperation. And so you have Japanese money, Indian money, Singaporean money, Korean money, and American money, and Chinese money flowing around the region looking for yield. So I think what we're going to see really is a region where function drives form, rather than in the Cold War analogy where form drives function and block-like arrangements prevail. And really what you end up with is what I would call fragmentation. As I said, a discombobulated region, different coalitions, and issue-specific coalitions. That's a much more ad hoc future than the way people talk about it. And it's one that both the United States and China will need to try to adapt to. And whichever country adapts better and works to become the standard setter, I think will be the more successful country in the region over the long term.
You've said that the Asia Pacific is really becoming more Asia and less Pacific, and that the US is trending towards a greater security involvement there and a much less of an economic involvement there, and that is less sustainable and less productive for the region. Do you see that trend continuing? And maybe you could also talk a little bit about the different possible futures here, depending on the results of the election in the US in November.
Sure. I mean, I've argued for a long time that the United States has a structural problem in Asia. It's not a function of this administration or the last administration or the Bush administration in which I've served. If you go back to the way I talked about change in the region after 1997-98, there's been a lot of structural change. And I think from my vantage point, the United States has not adapted very effectively. When I think about American leadership in Asia in the post-World War II period, and particularly after the 1960s, when the US and Japan signed their security treaty, and when Asia's economies became export-driven and really began to power their way to prosperity. There were two pillars of American leadership in the Pacific. One was related to security, and the other was economic. The security pillar was because of America's alliances and forward deployed military presence, things like carrier battle groups. The United States really provided the security umbrella that kept the peace, either directly or as an indirect security provider for nearly every country in the region, except more recently, who? For China, and to a lesser extent for countries like North Korea. But that wasn't the end of the story. The United States was also a leader in Asia because of the economic pillars of its leadership. It was the demand for which Asia's export-led economies powered their way to prosperity. And as we were saying earlier, it was the standard setter, and it was the driver of trade and investment rules, norms, and liberalization. So when I look at Asia today and how it's evolving, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific, not until China and Japan have a moment that's analogous to what happened in Europe between France and Germany. And so the United States was, is, and as far as my eyes can see, going to be a major provider of security for countries that are afraid of China, and basically for every major country in the region. But economically, the U.S. role as a demand driver is shrinking. U.S. trade with every country in Asia is going up in absolute terms, but it's declining everywhere in relative terms. And so what that means is intra-Asian demand, rather than trans-Pacific demand, is going to become more important. And so what does that mean for that other pillar of American leadership? It needs to be the standard setter. But what's happening, whether it's withdrawal for TPP or it's the refusal to participate in multilateral institutions, the United States is withdrawing for that role. And so I worry that the United States will bolster its security role while becoming less important and less salient on the things that really matter in Asia over the long term. The business of Asia is business. Now, what could change that? A real security confrontation between the United States and China, or blunt coercion by China against its neighbors, not economic coercion, military coercion that would scramble the region in ways that would lead to a much more Cold War-like setup and scenario. That's something we need to look at. But one thing we've learned from coronavirus, frankly, is that while it's entrenching and refueling the U.S.-China security competition in so many ways, these two countries can't cooperate on anything, apparently, even in the face of the worst pandemic in over 100 years and the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression. So if they can't cooperate on this, they probably can't cooperate on much of anything. But what that means for countries in the region is that if you can't get a coalition for collective action with the US and China cooperating as part of it, you fall back on self-help. And everything I've talked about and the way I see the region evolving is these countries are much more capable to take their own destiny in their own hands and try to shape the future themselves. And that's what I think, ironically enough, for all their differences, neither the United States nor China really understand about the future.
We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go to an audience question, which is from Claire McMullen in Washington, D.C. How might the China versus U.S. success in the race for a COVID vaccine influence both countries' foreign policy in the region? And I'll just add on to that we've seen China making promises to some Southeast Asian countries about if it develops a vaccine, giving them priority access.
That's right. I think it'll have three basic effects. The first will be psychological. If China gets to a vaccine first, it will have enormous psychological effects in the region. It'll showcase Chinese innovation, Chinese technology. That brings me to the second point. China will probably use a vaccine for diplomatic and strategic ends in terms of negotiating access to the vaccine with its neighbors. There may be trade-offs for countries in that, and that will be an opportunity for China to bolster not just its profile, but its power in the region. That brings me really to the third issue, which is I think for most other countries in Asia, not China nor the United States, vaccine nationalism is very troubling. There are very few countries that can produce vaccines or innovate around vaccines, and they're going to want access to it. And so how both China but also the United States play that will have both psychological and strategic effects. And I think the United States needs to be wise to that, not just in how fast it gets a vaccine, but how its own version of vaccine nationalism may or may not play in terms of its relationships in Asia and around the world.
Well, that is a perfect ending point for our segment. Thank you so much, Evan, for joining us. And I'm going to hand things back to my Axios colleague, Dave Lawler.
Thanks, Bethany. Our next guest is William J. Burns. He's president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and one of America's most distinguished diplomats. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. Ambassador Burns, it's great to be with you. So we've got a pandemic colliding with America First, slamming into these existing, shifting global power dynamics that you've written and spoken about. So you've laid out three paths forward for the future of American foreign policy. Retrenchment would see America pull further back. Restoration would be just the opposite, see us really lean into our superpower status. And I'll let you describe the third path, which is reinvention, and why you see that as the smart way forward for American foreign policy.
Sure. Well, again, it's great to be with you, Dave, and great to do this in partnership with Axios. As you just suggested, the pandemic has, in many respects, I think, both accelerated and exposed a lot of pre-existing conditions on the international landscape. I mean, major shifts in power among states, especially with the rise of China, major challenges beyond the reach of any one state, like climate change or the pandemic, and major uncertainties about the role of the United States, the main driver of the old international order since the end of the Cold War, now seen by too many people around the world to be drunk at the wheel. But I think if the pandemic has accelerated and exposed a lot of trend lines, it also clarifies our choices. And that's what I tried to lay out in the essay that we're discussing. As you suggested, I think restoration is one tempting option. In other words, the sense that you can turn the clock back to America's role, not just in 2016, but in much of the post-Cold War period, a return to a kind of expansive and ambitious view of American leadership in the world. The downsides of that, I think, are pretty obvious. It's the overreach that got us into a lot of trouble and caused us to do an enormous amount of self-injury as well as injury to the region in the Iraq War in 2003. And I don't think it's clear at all that there's the domestic appetite or resources right now for that kind of a sense that you can turn the clock back. The world has changed, even in the course of the last 4 years, while we've been digging a hole for ourselves, I think, in American society. And by the same token, I think the downside of retrenchment as an option is in many ways the other side of the coin from overreach. It's underreach. It's the concern that you can't deal effectively with a lot of the big challenges before us, whether it's domestic renewal, whether it's coping with global challenges like the next pandemic or climate change, whether it's competing effectively with China, unless you're investing in allies. So, as a recovering diplomat, it won't surprise you that I tend to support a third option, which in the essay at least I call reinvention, which is really about trying to find a new balance for a new era on the international landscape, borrowing the best, I think, of what proponents of retrenchment talk about, which is restraint and greater discipline in American leadership, a very careful matching of ends to means, a sharp focus on domestic renewal. And combining that with, I think, the best of what many restorationists argue, which is, a tempered sense of optimism and confidence about what America can achieve in the world. And I think that notion of reinvention as a strategy has to be aimed clearly at three main priorities. The first and most important, in my view, is domestic renewal. It's how do you, for example, conduct trade policies which really do serve the interests of inclusive economic growth at home? How do you resuscitate international cooperation on global health issues? We've seen the consequences of not doing that in the current pandemic. I think, second, you also have to work with allies, mobilize coalitions of countries, shape international rules to deal with those future shocks to our system, whether it's climate change or the next pandemic. And third, I think it's going to be really important to mobilize coalitions, work with partners and allies to compete effectively with China. Our biggest asset in that competition, in many respects, alongside domestic renewal, is our capacity to draw on alliances. That's what sets us apart from lonelier powers like China or Russia today. So it's all a lot easier said than done. I know how hard it is to navigate, when you're trying to make decisions about foreign policy, but it just strikes me that that kind of a strategy based on reinvention makes the most sense for America as we look at a really complicated international landscape, and as we look at the huge imperatives of domestic renewal.
I'd like to highlight a couple aspects of that complicated international landscape you referred to, one being Iran. You helped make the Iran deal happen. Obviously, President Trump has withdrawn the U.S. from that deal. He's still trying to torpedo it, essentially, as we speak. How would you engage with Iran going forward in light of what's happened over the last few years? And do you see trying to salvage the Iran deal as something that we can and should attempt to do?
Yeah, I mean, first, I have no illusions about the difficulty of dealing with Iran, whether it's on the nuclear issue or its threatening actions across the Middle East. There's no easy answer for that. But I am convinced of a couple of things. First, I think that the approach that this administration has chosen has produced sharply negative results. The administration pulled out of the comprehensive nuclear agreement more than 2 years ago, arguing that it was going to produce a better deal. The result has been no deal. It's been an Iran that's gradually restarting its nuclear program that today has something like 10 times the stockpile of enriched uranium that it had under the comprehensive nuclear deal, that continues to engage in threatening actions across the Middle East. We've done serious damage to some of our most important alliances, especially with our European allies, by pulling out of the deal against their wishes and their arguments. We've opened the door, I think, for China to strengthen its relationship with this Iranian regime. We've increased the chances of collisions, I think, between the United States and Iran in a part of the world that has more than its share of insecurities and instabilities already. I think the problem with the administration's strategy has been that it hasn't tethered its so-called maximum pressure, which of course can do a lot of damage to the Iranian economy, to realistic aims. The assumption has been that you can, through maximum pressure, produce either the implosion of the Iranian regime or its capitulation. And much as I would like to see a change for the Iranian people, I don't think either of those are realistic objectives. In other words, the administration has employed a kind of coercive diplomacy, which can work if it's done effectively. That's all coercion and no diplomacy. And that's produced, I think, as I said, sharply negative consequences. I do think it's going to be important, if you have a new administration, to return to diplomacy, backed up by military and economic leverage in dealing with Iran. Vice President Biden has said publicly that he would seek to return to compliance with the comprehensive nuclear agreement if the Iranians return fully to compliance. I know that's much easier said than done. There'd also be a need, I'm convinced, to embark with our allies on an immediate negotiation to try to strengthen and extend some of the timelines in the existing agreement. None of that, as I said before, is going to be easy. You'd also have to push back, again, with partners and allies against threatening Iranian behavior in the region. We ought to seek much more energetically than has been the case in recent years, a diplomatic settlement of a catastrophic war in Yemen, which means pushing not just the Iranians, but also the Saudis and others to bring an end, a diplomatic end to that conflict. So, none of that is a perfect prescription for dealing with Iran. But in my experience, over 3.5 decades, perfect is rarely on the menu in diplomacy. I think that kind of approach is the best of the available alternatives for ensuring that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon, and over time to reduce the ways in which it can threaten our interests and the interests of our friends in the Middle East.
I think we could pull on a lot of threads from that Iran conversation for quite some time, but let's move to Russia first. You were ambassador in Moscow. If a new administration does come in, what should that first conversation with Vladimir Putin, or first series of conversations trying to set the terms of that relationship, look like?
Well, most of my gray hair came from the 2 tours I spent as American diplomat in Russia. It's an extremely complicated relationship to try to navigate. And the reality, I think, that you have to understand at the start is that we're going to be operating within a pretty narrow band of possibilities in dealing with Vladimir Putin's Russia, from the sharply competitive to the very nastily adversarial. A lot's going to depend, in answering your question about that initial conversation, on to what extent Russia continues to interfere in our electoral process, because that's going to shape a lot of the nature of that conversation, what's possible in the relationship. I think it's going to be very important to be direct about, what we will not tolerate in that relationship. I think it's going to be very important to restore a sense of partnership and cooperation with our allies, especially in Europe, in dealing with Russia. I also think it's going to be important to try to preserve, as adversarial as that relationship can be and is likely to be, to preserve some guardrails in the relationship. So if the New START agreement, which reduces, monitors, verifies the strategic nuclear arsenals of both the United States and Russia, still the world's only two nuclear superpowers, if that agreement has not been extended by January of 2021, I think a part of that initial conversation would be aimed at doing that very quickly as well, because even in the nastiest of relationships, and I have no illusions about how nasty the relationship with Putin's Russia can become, it is important to preserve those kind of guardrails, not as a favor to Russia or anyone else, but in our own cold-blooded self-interest.
And last hotspot, I'll ask you about North Korea. We've learned a little bit more about President Trump's relationship with North Korea through Bob Woodward's reporting on these letters that have gone back and forth. How would you engage with North Korea? And do you think there is a nuclear deal that serves America's interests and that could satisfy the North Koreans that's out there to be made with Kim Jong-un?
It's going to be very tough, is the honest answer. And what's happened over the last almost 4 years, despite the exchange of love letters that I suppose we'll all read about in Bob Woodward's new book, there's been an expansion of North Korea's nuclear and missile program. I think another very unfortunate dimension of what's happened in the last 4 years is that we haven't invested as much in working with our crucial treaty allies in Japan and South Korea. That's going to be critical to resuscitate, I think, in trying to approach the challenge of North Korea's nuclear and missile program. Whether we like it or not, we're also going to have to try to work with China on the North Korean issue, given the leverage that China has over the North Korean leadership and its economy. It's going to be very tough, is the honest answer. And while I never criticize President Trump's decision to try to engage directly with Kim Jong-un, because relationships with leaderships do matter, I think it's a huge mistake when you become so infatuated with those personal relationships that you lose sight of the practical problems that have to be solved. So none of that is going to be easy in dealing with North Korea, but I think the most important thing is going to be restore cooperation with our allies in approaching that problem.
And in our last 30 seconds, I guess, we're in an election season in which all of the issues we've been talking about have played sort of second fiddle to the virus and the economic implications of the pandemic. How do you see, the recovery domestically as maybe intertwined with American foreign policy?
Yeah, I think we always tell ourselves in foreign policy, kind of in the Washington establishment, that smart foreign policy begins at home, in a strong economic and political system. I think we haven't done nearly as good a job as demonstrating to our fellow citizens that smart foreign policy ends at home too. It helps create greater economic opportunities. We have to, as I said before, pursue trade policies overseas that are going to help create a level playing field for Americans to compete, to give especially small businesses a fighting chance to compete on the international landscape. I think the pandemic is another illustration of this. Dealing effectively with the pandemic, ensuring the health of American citizens, depends to a considerable extent on working with others. This is not a threat that honors borders. It's one of those problems without passports that we're going to have to increasingly deal with on the international landscape. So recognizing and deepening that connection between foreign policy and domestic renewal, I think, is going to be the biggest single challenge for several administrations to come.
All right, that seems like a great place to leave it. Thanks so much, Ambassador Burns. Really appreciate your insights. And now I want to bring Bethany back in for a Why It Matters section on all of our discussions today. Hi, Bethany. So really interesting conversations today. One thing that I took away from my conversation with Maha about the Middle East was this idea that as Arab economies move away from oil, or at least diversify, there are so many aspects of society that need to change. And one thing is education. These are places in which rote learning has often been the rule. They haven't necessarily fostered the kind of critical thinking that a diversified and creative economy will need. And so, it's not just this idea that we need to pick new sectors to go into. You also need to have a society that's ready to innovate and to, adapt to this new 21st century economy.
Well, that's really interesting. It sounds like there are some challenges there that, sitting here in Washington, D.C., we in the United States may not have thought of these, totally new challenges that the Middle East may be facing. And that reminds me kind of what Evan was saying about Asia. Again, in the U.S., we think of Asia in terms of U.S.-China competition and even rivalry, competing over who's going to be, the central part of Asia. Is it going to be a Sino-centric or a U.S.-centric? But Evan was saying that actually neither the U.S. nor China are really playing that role right now. And that has left Asian countries from Japan to South Korea to India to set their own standards, to make their own rules. He calls this a process of fragmentation, which is not entirely what we would have expected.
Really interesting. And it obviously makes a lot of sense that we have our eyes trained on China right now. As for sitting in Washington, we're focused on what's happening in China, but obviously things are changing around the continent. And another big focus of any U.S. administration will be Russia. And I was interested in my conversation with Bill Burns that he, basically as a former ambassador to in Moscow, was talking about just how difficult it will be for the new administration, should Joe Biden win, to set the terms of its relationship with Russia, because you may be responding to election interference. There's going to be all sorts of tensions, but also you're going to have to try to create or extend or create a new nuclear arms treaty right off the bat in the opening weeks. There are going to be real consequential issues. So you can't just be protesting against what Russia's doing. You also have to work with the Russians. So I think we had 3 really interesting conversations today. Thanks so much, Bethany. And thanks to all of you for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter, faster. If you like this conversation and would like to sign up for more Axios content, please sign up for any of our newsletters at signup.axios.com. And you can catch Bethany's newsletter, Axios China, or mine, Axios World, on there. Thanks so much to our partner, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, for partnering with Axios for today's event. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. Really enjoyed it.